My name is Nora Ellington. I am 62 years old, a widow who once kept order and quiet in a public school library. For nearly 3 decades, I have believed that love meant paying the bill and saying yes. Tonight I learned what it costs to be the steady pillar no one notices until they want a place to lean. The dining room at the country club glowed with candles and cut glass. A quartet played something soft enough to vanish under conversation. I held the seating chart with both hands, trying to explain why the older guests should be moved away from the speakers. Claire lifted her chin. Her lipstick was the shade she wears for victory. Then her voice cut the room in half. "You are the worst mother anyone could have. If you want to give me a present, disappear." The word worst rang like a dropped fork. Conversation stopped. Champagne paused mid-pour. The wedding planner's pen stopped above the page. I felt the paper shake in my fingers, not from fear exactly, more from the knowledge that a line had been crossed that would not be uncrossed. A guest at the next table whispered, as if asking a caption to appear in the air. I could almost see it. Worst mother? I looked at the faces that had judged me long before this night. Daniel's mother pressed a linen napkin to her lips. Daniel stared at the floor so he would not have to choose. I saw my reflection in the window, a small woman in a simple dress, hair silvering, posture straight, the librarian who paired lost children with the right book and paid for overdue fees herself when parents could not. I had stitched costumes at midnight. I had packed lunches until my fingers smelled like oranges and bread. I had learned to stretch checks like rubber bands without letting them snap. In the silence, another set of words appeared in my mind like chapter cards in a film. Wedding canceled. House sold. The last gift. She told me to disappear. I did not yet know how those lines would become my map. I only knew I was already walking. The wedding planner took a step toward me. Claire turned away, satisfied, as if victory were a place with lights and witnesses. I did not argue. I did not cry. My mouth formed a small, careful line that said enough. I laid the seating chart on the table, aligning its edge with the tablecloth seam because order is how I breathe. My heart thudded against my ribs like a quiet fist. For a moment, I imagined the library at closing time, the way a room exhales when the last child leaves, the way light pools on an empty desk. There is a particular peace in a finished day, and I felt that peace slide over me now. Daniel reached for Claire's wrist. She shook him off. A server tried to refill my glass and missed. A bead of champagne toppled onto my knuckles and traced a cold path to my wristwatch. I remember the watch because my husband gave it to me the spring before the illness. It kept perfect time while I learned that love sometimes means holding a hand through the night so the other person can sleep. Time has never lied to me. I drew in one slow breath. I set the glass down. I stood straight. There are rooms that feed on humiliation, and the only way to starve them is to leave. I turned toward the door and walked. My heels did not hurry. The doors folded shut behind me with the gentle sound of a verdict being filed. The hallway smelled like lemons and starch. I could hear music again, thin through the wood, refusing to carry my name. Under the gold sconce light, I let the air fill my lungs. The words kept pulsing. Wedding canceled, house sold, the last gift. I could see my kitchen table at home, the neat files labeled in my hand. I could see the deed my father signed. I could see a small wooden box that once held recipe cards and now might hold something truer. I could also hear another sentence, simple and sharp. She told me to disappear. I stepped into the night air and felt the cool settle my skin. Somewhere inside, a toast resumed. Out here, the parking lot shone like a clean slate. I unlocked my car and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. I listened to my breath, a steady metronome. Quiet is not surrender. Quiet is a choice. There would be phone calls. There would be fees. There would be consequences. There would also be order. There would be law. There would be a line only I could draw. When I started the engine, the dashboard clock turned to a new minute. I spoke aloud so I would hear my own conviction. I am not the worst mother. I am the woman who knows when to walk. Then I pulled onto the road and let the club's lights fall behind me like a curtain at the end of an act. The next act had already named itself. Wedding canceled. House sold. The last gift. She told me to disappear. I would let those lines guide me home. The door of the ladies' lounge closed behind me with a hush that felt like sanctuary, yet the silence could not hold. Faint laughter seeped through the walls from the rehearsal dinner. I stood in front of the ornate mirror, the gold frame curling like vines, and looked at the woman reflected back. My hands still trembled as if they belonged to someone else. My face seemed unfamiliar, pale under the lights, eyes wide and wet. The words still rang. Worst mother, disappear. I leaned closer to the mirror. What did they see when they looked at me? A woman whose dress came from a department store instead of a boutique. A widow who carried herself politely, who spoke softly, who never belonged at their polished tables. My lips pressed together as though I might stop the shaking with sheer discipline. I tried to imagine that glass surface as steady water, but instead I saw fractures, lines like cracks spreading outward. The sound of laughter outside turned sharper, echoing in my head. I could almost distinguish Claire's voice among them. My daughter, my only child. I closed my eyes, and memory rushed in with brutal clarity. I remembered the night the hospital called about my husband. His heart had given out suddenly, in a quiet room far from mine. I had run down a long hallway lit with fluorescent light that hummed like a machine. They handed me a plastic bag with his watch and wallet. I was 34, already with gray at my temples, and Claire was 5. She clung to me at the funeral, her small body pressed against my skirt, whispering that she was afraid I would vanish too. I swore then that I would never leave her, no matter how heavy the years became. The mirror blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I gripped the marble counter until my knuckles whitened. The reflection seemed to whisper, "After all these years, is this how it ends? Sacrifice mistaken for weakness, devotion rewritten as embarrassment." Another memory pushed forward, unbidden yet vivid. The kitchen table in the first apartment after my husband died, rent overdue, bills stacked like bricks, and me marking numbers on a yellow pad calculating which payment could wait. Claire sat at the table with coloring pencils, drawing our little family, herself, me, and a son with a smile. I brewed a pot of chamomile tea that night, the one comfort I could afford. The steam rose with the faint scent of flowers, gentle against the weight of unpaid bills. That cup became a ritual. Every evening, after putting Claire to bed, I drank chamomile to remind myself that peace could be steeped from dried petals, even in grief. I can still see the mug clearly, white ceramic with a chipped rim. The handle warmed against my palm. That tea was my anchor. In it lived the promise that tomorrow would arrive, that Claire would grow, that my efforts would matter. And tonight, in this mirrored room, I realized I had not tasted chamomile in months. Somewhere along the way, between her law school graduation and her engagement to Daniel, I had set the mug aside, as though I no longer needed comfort. But the truth pressed hard against my chest. I had replaced that cup of tea with silence. Silence when she dismissed my advice. Silence when she let Daniel's parents believe lies about our finances. Silence when she looked at me with the embarrassment reserved for someone unwanted. Now the silence had roared back, sharpened into a command in front of strangers. Disappear. I traced the outline of my reflection's face. The woman staring back was older than I remembered, lines drawn by years of sacrifice. But she still had steady eyes. I whispered to myself, "You are not the worst mother. You are the woman who brewed chamomile tea when the world broke apart. You are the woman who kept promises." My own voice echoed in the marble and gilt. A burst of laughter erupted again from the hall, as if mocking my affirmation. I let it wash over me without flinching. Their judgment was not my truth. My truth was the tea, the chipped cup, the daughter I raised alone, the vows I kept. If Claire could not see it, perhaps she never would. I straightened, wiped beneath my eyes with a tissue, and smoothed my dress. The reflection steadied. Outside, music swelled again, but I no longer wanted to re-enter that hall. I wanted air. I wanted quiet. and I wanted to remember who I was before being told I was the worst. I thought of my father, a man who kept meticulous files, who told me that numbers never lie. I thought of the deed folded in my desk drawer at home, his handwriting still visible on the margin. I thought of the power I had always carried quietly, the power of order, of documentation, of persistence. They had mistaken silence for weakness, but silence can also be the ground where strength grows. The mirror showed me one last image, a woman who could still choose. I opened my purse and found an old packet of chamomile tea tucked in a corner, left there months ago. My fingers curled around it like an oath. That was my anchor. That was my reminder. I stepped away from the counter, pulled the door open, and let the voices of celebration spill over me. For the last time, I walked past their laughter without stopping. As I left the lounge, the laughter from the hall still echoing faintly in my ears, a tide of memories pulled me backward. My body walked toward the parking lot, but my mind returned to years stitched together with sacrifice. They were not glamorous years, not years written in the polished tones of society pages. They were the kind of years that mothers quietly carry until no one remembers they happened at all. I saw myself crouched at the old Singer sewing machine in our tiny apartment. Claire was 7, and Halloween was her universe. She wanted to be a queen, not a princess, because queens ruled. We could not afford the shiny costumes in the store window, so I sat night after work, cutting fabric under a dim lamp, turning scraps into something regal. I remember her face the morning she tried it on, eyes wide, cheeks glowing. She twirled in the living room and declared she was the most beautiful queen in the world. That moment was worth every blister on my fingers. But no one at the rehearsal dinner tonight knew that story. To them, I was only an embarrassment in a department store dress. The memories shifted again. Claire, in her first year at the private elementary school I could barely afford. She cried at night, overwhelmed by homework, worried she did not belong. I took on a second shift at the library, shelving books until my back ached, so that she could stay in a classroom where her teachers spoke of Ivy League futures. I remember walking home at midnight with the scent of paper and dust clinging to my hair. The streets were empty, but I whispered promises to myself. She will have more. She will not feel small. Then came college tuition. I sold my wedding ring, the one thing of value left from my husband, to make the first payment. I told Claire I had traded it in for her textbooks. She smiled, believing it was an adventure, not a sacrifice. Law school followed. By then, I worked 2 jobs, mornings at the library, evenings at the grocery store, my knees swollen from standing. Every check went toward her future, and every time I signed my name on a payment slip, I felt pride. Yet tonight, she stood before me and declared I was the worst mother anyone could have. My chest tightened as these images crowded together. They were not dramatic scenes. They were the quiet labors of survival. Meals skipped so she could have ballet shoes, vacations canceled so she could attend tutoring, birthdays spent not at restaurants but with homemade cakes I baked after midnight. None of these moments were displayed on her engagement ring or remembered in her laughter among the Prescotts. There was only one person who ever truly witnessed the weight of it all, my mother, Helen. She's 83 now, her back curved with time but her eyes sharp as winter air. When my husband died, she moved in with me for a while, helping with Claire at night so I could grieve in stolen moments. She saw me work double shifts, saw me patch shoes with glue, and saw me count pennies for bus fare. She never once called me weak. She simply poured tea at the kitchen table and said, "Steady, Nora. You are steadier than you know." Helen's voice still lives in me, the one reminder that sacrifice has meaning even when the world forgets. She was there the day I signed the deed to the Maple Avenue house, a gift from my father, and she said, "Do not rush to give it away." Houses carry blood and sweat. Make sure she understands what it means. I thought I understood better. I thought love required immediate surrender. Now, as I stood in the cool night air, Helen's warning rang louder than the laughter behind me. I imagine her sitting in her modest living room, knitting by lamplight, waiting for the call I will make later. She will hear my voice cracked with exhaustion, and she will know, without me saying it, that tonight something broke. She will remind me, as she always does, that dignity is not found in being celebrated, but in being true to one's own soul. The parking lot stretched before me, and I felt the years stretch behind me. All those hours, all those nights, erased with a single sentence from Claire. Yet as painful as it was, I realized something else. If Helen could see the truth, then perhaps I was not invisible. Perhaps what I had done mattered, even if the ones I did it for had chosen to forget. I reached my car and sat behind the wheel. My hands pressed the steering wheel firmly, as if holding all those forgotten years in place. A question formed quietly in my mind. If no one remembers your sacrifices, were they real? I answered myself with the voice Helen once used. They were real because you lived them. They were real because you endured them, and they will guide what comes next. When I reached home that night, silence greeted me. The small 3-bedroom house where I had raised Claire alone felt heavier than usual, as if it too had overheard her words. The hallway lamp cast a faint glow across the laundry room door where my mother of the bride dress still hung. Pale blue silk, chosen after weeks of saving, its folds shimmered faintly in the dim light. I had imagined wearing it with pride, walking Claire down the aisle, being recognized not as a burden, but as a mother who had done her best. Now it seemed more like a costume for a play that had already been canceled. I slipped off my shoes and placed my purse on the kitchen table. The house was filled with traces of my preparations, the guest book I had crafted by hand, the box of emergency supplies for the wedding, bandages, safety pins, mints. Each item had been placed with care, each symbolizing a role I had accepted without complaint. Tonight they looked like props left behind after the actors had abandoned the stage. My eyes drifted toward the stack of folders in the corner of the room. Inside them lay documents I had not opened in months. Bank statements, tuition receipts, the deed to a house across town. That house, the colonial on Maple Avenue, with white shutters and an oak tree in the yard. Claire and Daniel had been living there for 2 years. To their friends, to his family, it was their house. To me, it was a piece of my father's legacy. My father had left it to me when he passed, a clear transfer in his will without conditions. He had said only, "Use it wisely." Houses hold history. They carry the story of those who built them. At the time, I thought he meant I should make sure Claire had security, a safe foundation. So when she and Daniel announced their engagement, I told them they could move in right away. They assumed, as children often do, that it was already theirs. I never corrected them. My plan had been to sign over the deed as a wedding gift, a symbolic gesture, one more sacrifice tucked quietly into the pattern of my life. But as I stared at the pale blue silk dress, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I questioned the story I had written for myself. Was it wise to surrender the last tangible piece of my father's work to a daughter who had told me to disappear? Was it love, or was it desperation to be needed that made me consider handing over everything? The conflict burned in me like a quiet fire. My heart argued one way. Mothers give, mothers forgive. Mothers let go of their own needs to make room for their children's futures. But my mind whispered another truth, one I had ignored too long. Gifts lose meaning when they are received with entitlement. Legacies are wasted when the recipient has no respect for the giver. I poured myself a cup of tea, not chamomile this time, but black, strong, and bitter. The steam curled upward, fogging my glasses. I remembered Helen's words when I first told her about my plan. "Nora, do not be so quick to part with what your father built. A house is not just walls. It is labor, sacrifice, and memory. If she does not understand that, giving it to her will not teach her." I had brushed off her warning, believing Claire would grow into gratitude. Now, the memory of Helen's caution settled heavily in my chest. I carried the tea into the living room and sat in the armchair by the window. Outside, the street was quiet, the lamplight casting long shadows across the pavement. I thought of Claire's laughter with the Prescotts, the way she pretended the Maple Avenue house was her inheritance, her accomplishment. She never once asked about property taxes, insurance, or repairs. She simply lived there, as though it had been conjured for her. Was I about to reward that arrogance with legal ownership? Or was it time to acknowledge that love requires boundaries as much as sacrifice? My hand traced the rim of the teacup slowly, as though circling the edges of the decision. The dress in the laundry room seemed to watch me, waiting. Once it represented a future where my sacrifices were honored in public, where I could stand tall as the mother of the bride. Tonight it symbolized something else, the cost of silence, the cost of giving until nothing remained. I rose, walked to the corner, and opened the file cabinet. My fingers closed around the folder marked Maple Avenue. The deed was still inside, crisp and undeniable. My name, not Claire's, not Daniel's, mine. I held it in both hands and felt a surprising steadiness. My father's legacy was not a gift to be squandered in a moment of sentiment. It was a responsibility. And perhaps, after everything, I owed it to myself to honor that responsibility before giving it away. I set the deed on the kitchen table beside the untouched guest book. Two different futures lay side by side, one of surrender, one of reclaiming. I did not yet know which I would choose, but for the first time in years, I felt the weight of the choice was mine, not dictated by expectation or guilt. The clock ticked in the silence, steady as a heartbeat. I sipped the last of my bitter tea, knowing that by morning the decision would begin to take shape. The papers still lay scattered across my kitchen table when dawn crept through the curtains. I had not slept. The dress remained hanging on the laundry room door, silent and expectant, but I no longer looked at it with longing. Instead, my attention stayed fixed on the folder marked Maple Avenue. The deed, the bank records, the notes my father had left, all of it waiting for me to decide whether to cling to the old story or finally write a new one. I sat at the table with a fresh pot of tea, this time chamomile again. My hands rested on the porcelain cup, the warmth grounding me. The house was still mine. That simple fact echoed in my mind like a bell. For 2 years, I had allowed Claire to live there and had let her present it to the world as her own. I had told myself it was temporary, that soon I would hand her the deed as a gift. But gifts cannot be demanded, and gratitude cannot be forced. I reached for the old metal filing cabinet tucked in the corner of the dining room. It belonged to my father, and its drawers stuck if you pulled too hard. I opened the bottom one carefully, hearing the familiar squeak of old steel. Inside were years of documents, neatly organized in my father's handwriting until the day he passed. Receipts, tax filings, notes scribbled on yellowed paper. His voice seemed to live inside that drawer, reminding me of his mantra: people may argue with your words, but they cannot argue with numbers. I leafed through the files until I found the folder he had labeled Contacts. Inside was a business card I had nearly forgotten. Martin Hale, attorney at law. He had been my father's attorney, then later mine when I needed help settling the estate. I had not spoken to him in months, maybe longer, but his voice had always been steady, practical, unshaken, the kind of voice I needed now. I stared at the card for a long time, my thumb rubbing across the faded ink. Once, I would have hesitated, second-guessed myself, wondered what Claire would think if she knew I was making calls behind her back. But her words from the rehearsal dinner still cut through my hesitation. You're the worst mother anyone could have. If you want to give me a present, disappear. I dialed the number. Martin Hale, came the familiar baritone. It's Nora, I said quietly. My own voice startled me with how calm it sounded. I need your help. Nora. Of course, everything is all right? No, I admitted. Not exactly. I need to talk about the house on Maple Avenue. A pause. I could almost hear him rearranging papers on his desk. That was your father's house, correct? I thought you intended to transfer it to your daughter. I did. But things have changed. I need to know what it would take to sell it. Another pause, heavier this time. Sell it? Yes, I said, my tone firmer now. Immediately, if possible. Cash buyer, minimal contingencies. How fast could it be done? Martin exhaled. Slowly. If you are serious, I can make inquiries. With the current market, I could probably line up a buyer within 48 hours. But Nora, this is sudden. Are you sure? I closed my eyes for a moment. Images flashed. Claire's face twisted in anger, the hush of the dining room as she demanded I disappear, the smug glance of Victoria Prescott across the table. Then, just as sharp, I saw my father at his desk, adjusting his glasses, reminding me that numbers do not lie. I'm sure, I said. Silence stretched on the line, then Martin's voice softened. All right. Come by the office at noon. Bring the deed and any recent statements. We'll start the paperwork. I hung up, my hand lingering on the phone. The house was as good as sold. The decision that had haunted me all night had become an action, solid and irreversible. I leaned back in my chair and looked again at the dress, still hanging like a ghost of a future that would never be. For a long time I had equated silence with weakness. I had endured Claire's slights, the Prescott's condescension, the loneliness of widowhood. I had believed that swallowing pain was the price of motherhood. But silence could mean something else. It could be power. Tonight, I had chosen not to argue, not to defend myself, not to explain. I had chosen to act. The pivot was quiet, almost invisible to anyone outside these walls. But I felt it. A shift from enduring to deciding, from carrying weight to setting it down. I gathered the documents into a neat stack, clipped them together, and placed them in my worn leather bag. Then I washed the teacup, set it upside down on the drying rack, and turned off the kitchen light. The house seemed lighter already, as though it too understood the burden was no longer mine alone. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have, as if it knew the weight of what I was about to say. I sat at the edge of my bed, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains, the leather bag with the deed and statements resting at my feet. I had rehearsed the words in my mind through the long hours of the night, but when the moment came, they still scraped against my throat like glass. Martin answered on the second ring. Nora. I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Is everything all right? Plans change, I said. The words came out steady, sharper than I expected. I want to move forward with the sale. Today. On the other end, silence lingered for several seconds. I pictured Martin leaning back in his chair, eyebrows raised, his hand covering the receiver as if to buy himself time to think. Nora, he finally said, yesterday you were planning to give the house to your daughter as a wedding gift. That was less than 24 hours ago. Now you want to sell it outright. Forgive me, but this is sudden, even for you. I drew in a long breath. Yes, suddenly, but necessary. He cleared his throat, his professional tone slipping back into place. I need to ask the question. Is anyone pressuring you? Is this decision entirely yours? It is mine, I answered without hesitation. Entirely mine. Another pause. Then his voice softened. All right, then let us discuss logistics. I can reach out to a few cash buyers I trust. They won't haggle. They understand value when they see it. If we set everything in motion today, I can have offers by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow? The words settled over me like a verdict. Claire's perfect wedding was supposed to begin in just a few hours, and by the time she realized it was unraveling, the home she believed hers would already be out of her grasp. Do it, I whispered. All right, Martin said carefully. I'll draw up the preliminary documents. We'll need your signature in person. Can you be at my office by noon? Yes. He hesitated again. Nora, forgive me, but I must ask one more thing. What brought this on? You're not someone who acts on impulse. I closed my eyes and saw Claire's face again, twisted with contempt, her voice slicing through me. You're the worst mother anyone could have. If you want to give me a present, disappear. I opened my eyes and looked at the mirror across from the bed. My reflection stared back, a woman with lines carved deep from years of sacrifice, silver strands in her hair, eyes that had learned endurance but were now learning resolve. She asked me to disappear, I said quietly. I'm honoring her request. The silence on the other end was different this time. Not hesitation, but recognition. Martin inhaled slowly, as though absorbing the truth without judgment. "I see," he said at last. "Then I will handle everything with discretion. Leave the rest to me." "Thank you, Martin." When I ended the call, I set the phone down and allowed myself to sit in the quiet. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from clarity. I had drawn the line at last. The house had always been more than wood and stone. It had been my father's legacy, the place where I once believed Claire would build a life rooted in gratitude. But last night's cruelty had stripped away any illusion that such a gift would be cherished. By selling it, I was not destroying her future. I was reclaiming mine. I rose, smoothed the bedspread with deliberate care, and picked up the leather bag. The papers inside rustled softly, like a chorus of witnesses to my choice. Each document carried the proof of my labor, my sacrifice, my patience. Numbers do not lie. Neither do deeds. As I prepared to leave, I noticed the chamomile cup still sitting in the sink from the night before. The faint trace of tea clung to the porcelain, a reminder of hours spent weighing silence against action. I rinsed it clean, set it upside down on the rack, and dried my hands slowly. The kitchen clock ticked toward 10. In 2 hours, I would place my name on new papers, releasing the house into other hands. Claire's story of entitlement would collapse quietly, without me ever raising my voice. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. My silence had not been surrendered. It had become my weapon. By the time I locked the front door and slid the leather bag over my shoulder, I felt steady enough to do what needed doing. The hallway clock read 9:40. Noon with Martin was set. Before that, there was another kind of paperwork that required a different voice. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, the contracts fanned out like a quiet jury, and dialed the wedding planner first. "Avery Shaw," she answered, bright and breathless. "It is Nora Ellington," I said. "Plans have changed. As of this morning, the event is canceled." Silence, then a flurry. "Canceled? I am sorry, what? The rehearsal only just—" "I am the contracting party of record," I said, even and clear. "Please initiate cancellations under Section 7. Notify all vendors immediately. Bill all fees to me. I accept responsibility in full." Her voice softened. Testing. "Nora, the timeline is tight. We can salvage—" "No," I said. "We will honor the contracts by ending them. Send confirmations by email within the hour," Avery exhaled. "Understood." "I will begin now," I thanked her, ended the call, and opened the venue agreement. The manager at the country club picked up on the second ring. "This is Ellington," I said. "Reservation number and TT." I read the line exactly. "Per clause 14, I am canceling the booking effective today. Charge the cancellation penalty. Send a paid invoice." He kept his tone professional. "We will process it immediately. I am sorry to hear that process," I said. "There is nothing to be sorry for." Next was the caterer. "Good morning, this is Nora. Please release the kitchen team and reallocate inventory. I authorize the fee schedule under last-minute cancellation. Send a final ledger with any perishables donated to the shelter, as our contract allows." The caterer hesitated. "That is generous of you." "We will document the donations," the florist answered with hands full of stems. "You are sure?" she said. And it was not a question. "I am sure," I said. "Prepare a partial delivery to the hospice across town, bill me for the labor and product, list the remainder as refuse where necessary. No one needs to throw beauty away when it can ease a hallway I called the string quartet. Please release the musicians," I said. "I will honor the cancellation penalty. Consider the balance a gratuity for the disruption." One of them laughed softly, grateful. "That is kinder than most," he said. "It is simply fair," I answered. "The photographer, the officiant, hair and makeup, the transportation service. With each call, the same rhythm. State the clause, name the fee, accept the cost. Ask for written confirmation. Calm is a language. Today, I spoke it fluently. I was not dismantling her day out of vengeance. I was closing a ledger that had been open too long. My inbox began to fill. Subject lines stacked into a quiet chorus. Cancellation confirmation. Service release. Invoice attached. I printed each email, slipped the pages into clear sleeves, and clipped them to the relevant contracts. The pile grew until it matched the weight in my chest and then, somehow, outweighed it. Paper has mass, order has mercy. On the counter, my phone buzzed with an unknown number, likely a guest from the rehearsal dinner. I let it ring. I did not owe explanations to an audience that applauded while my daughter humiliated me. I owed clarity to myself. Avery called back. "All parties notified," she said. "I'm sending a consolidated statement. Do you want me to contact the guests, or shall the family handle it?" "Route any questions to Daniel," I said. "He will decide what to tell them. My role is concluded." Avery paused. "Understood." "For what it is worth, you have been impeccably organized. Organization is what I have when approval is not available," I said, and thanked her. I placed my palm over the neat stack and felt its cool, smooth certainty. In my mind, I saw a black title card appearing across the screen the way an old film announces a new chapter. Wedding canceled. No exclamation point, no drama, just the truth in uppercase. I walked to the laundry room and glanced at the pale blue dress one more time. It no longer looked like a costume. It looked like a relic of a story I no longer agreed to perform. I lifted the garment bag, zipped it closed, and carried it to the closet. The act felt like lowering a flag. Not defeat, completion. Before leaving for Martin's office, I brewed a final cup of chamomile and stood by the sink as steam rose. I thought of Claire at 5, clutching my skirt at her father's funeral, of Claire at 25, throwing her arms around my neck at law school graduation, of Claire last night, leveling her voice like a blade. Love can hold contradictions in the same hand. Justice can, too. I rinsed the cup, turned off the light, and slid the folder marked with the printed title page into my bag. On the cover, in my plain handwriting, I had written 2 words to steady me if doubt returned. Legal closure. The clock shifted to 11:28. I stepped outside, locked the door, and felt the day open ahead like a clean ledger. Behind me, the printer tray held a final page cooling in the air. In the subject line, in bold, the words that would shape whatever came next. Wedding canceled. I had just finished sealing the folder when the pounding began. At first I thought it was a delivery, some neighbor's package was mislaid. But then the sharp rhythm turned unmistakable. Claire's knock. She did not wait for me to open. By the time I reached the door, she pushed it wide with all the force of her 20-something indignation. "You can't do this!" she shouted, her voice raw, her eyes wide with panic. "You can't just cancel everything. People are already arriving. The flowers, the music, the food." I stayed still, my back against the frame, and let her words crash over me. Silence has a weight. Sometimes it is heavier than anger. When she paused for breath, I crossed to the kitchen table. The folders were stacked there, precise and patient. Without raising my voice, I slid the top one toward her. She frowned. "What is this supposed to be?" "Documentation," I said. "Every contract, every deposit, every invoice. Read the totals, Claire. $78,000. Not from Blake's parents, not from you. From me." Her face flushed, denial ready, but before she could summon it, I opened another folder and spread the pages like cards on a table. Your tuition receipts, private elementary, college, law school, tutors, loan satisfaction letters, the education you wear as armor in every conversation. It was not Blake's father. It was me. She sank into a chair without realizing, eyes darting across the neat columns of numbers. "But Blake said—" "Blake was told what you allowed him to believe," I answered quietly. "A lie repeated often enough feels like the truth. You let his family assume I was a burden, that he rescued you, when in fact I was the one who carried the weight." Claire shook her head as if motion could erase paper. "That's not fair." "No," I said. "It is not." It has never been. I opened the third folder, heavier, older. The deed. I laid it in front of her, the signature line clear, the owner's name in bold, Nora Ellington. Her hand trembled as she read. "I don't understand." This is our house. It is my father's house," I said evenly. "Passed to me 3 years ago. I allowed you to live there. Interest-free, with no rent, no tax, no insurance. I thought I would sign it over as a wedding gift. I met her eyes, steady as glass. But gifts require respect, not demands. She slapped the deed shut, as if the sound could erase the ink. You can't sell it. We just finished renovations. All our things, with my retirement savings, I said, the calm in my voice surprising even me. $45,000 you called a loan from Blake's side. It was my sacrifice. Again, her mouth opened, then closed. No words came, only the sound of her breath, quick and shallow, filling the space where denial had lived. Finally, she whispered, "Why are you doing this to me?" I leaned closer, my tone softer but sharper. Than any shout, "Because you told me to. Last night, in front of every guest, you told me, if you want to give me a present, disappear. Do you remember?" Her eyes flickered. The memory stabbed through. "I didn't mean it." "You said it," I answered. "You looked at me and said I was the worst mother anyone could have. You asked me to vanish. I am only doing as you asked." The room went still. Claire stared at the folders, the deed, the ledger of years she had chosen not to see. Her knuckles whitened around the papers, but her defiance was trembling now, brittle as porcelain. I let silence hold us. No lecture, no raised tone, just the truth spread across the table, undeniable, in ink and numbers. At last, she dropped her gaze, and her voice cracked. "So what now?" "You sell the house, you cancel the wedding, you ruin everything. Then what?" "I will not ruin it," I said gently. "I release. The wedding is canceled. The house will be sold. You will learn to stand on your own without fabrications built on my sacrifices, and I will finally stand too, without begging for a daughter's approval." She pressed her hands to her temples, shaking her head. "People will think, people always think," I interrupted, "but numbers do not. Contracts do not. Deeds do not. They simply are." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The folders between us became a mirror of what we had built. One life of relentless giving, another of relentless taking. Then I closed the final folder, the sound precise as a gavel. "This is the record, Claire. Not rumor, not assumption. The record." Her shoulders sagged. I could see the girl she had once been, lost, frightened, not yet hardened by entitlement, but I did not reach across the table. I had given her enough already. This was the day I began to give to myself. "You told me to disappear," I said again, not cruel, only factual. "And today I have begun." The knock at the door came again, louder this time, followed by voices layered with confusion. I knew without looking who it was. Daniel, my future son-in-law, and behind him, his parents, the Prescotts, who had been circling this entire wedding like hawks with polished feathers. I opened the door with deliberate calm. Daniel's face carried panic. His parents wore masks of suspicion and control. "Mrs. Ellington," Daniel began, his tone urgent, "there's been a mistake. The venue called my mother. They said the wedding was canceled. Please tell me that's not true." "There is no mistake," I said, stepping aside. "Come in. Claire's in the kitchen. You should all hear the truth together." They moved past me, the scent of expensive perfume trailing with Victoria Prescott, her heels striking my modest floor like gavels. Richard Prescott followed, posture rigid, his silence the kind of silence that commands rooms. Daniel rushed ahead to Claire, who still sat at the table, pale, clutching the deed as if it were an anchor. "What happened?" Daniel demanded, dropping to her side. "Why are you crying? What is going on?" I did not raise my voice. I simply gestured to the table where the folders lay open. "This kitchen," I said, "will serve as our courtroom. Not of law, but of truth. Every page here is evidence. You deserve to see it, Daniel. And so do your parents." Claire whimpered, "Mom, please don't." I opened the first folder again, sliding it across the table toward Daniel. Wedding contracts. Every deposit, every payment, $78,000. All from me. Victoria leaned forward, her manicured nails clicking against the table as she skimmed the top page. Her face hardened. But Claire told us you could barely contribute. Daniel's father and I covered the significant costs. No, I said, my voice steady. Every cent was mine. She allowed you to believe otherwise. Daniel's eyes widened. He turned to Claire. Is that true? Claire stammered. I just thought it was easier if they believed. Easier to lie? I asked softly. The silence pressed down until Richard spoke, his voice cold. And the house? The deed she's holding? I placed my hand on the folder beneath Claire's trembling fingers and drew it out into the open. Maple Avenue. The home you've been living in for 2 years. It is not theirs. It has never been. It was my father's, then mine. I allowed them to live there rent-free. I paid the taxes. I paid the insurance. And this morning, I began the process of selling it. Claire's cry cracked the air. Daniel froze as though the ground had shifted beneath him. He took the deed, his lips moving silently as he read my name across the title. I thought this was your inheritance, he said, staring at Claire. She covered her face, tears spilling between her fingers. I never said it outright. I just didn't. Correct anyone. That's the same as lying, Daniel said, his voice low but full of hurt. I slid another folder into the center. Education records. Every tuition bill, every tutor, every loan I repaid. Claire's degrees were not funded by scholarships or by anyone else's generosity. They were funded by me, sacrificing retirement and stability so she could rise higher than I ever did. Victoria looked from the papers to Claire, disgust flickering across her face. All this time you let us believe. She let you believe, I said. I was silent, perhaps too silent. But today the silence ends. Daniel stood slowly, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. He looked at me, then at his parents, then finally at Claire. You built our relationship on stories that weren't true. About money, about family, about your mother. How am I supposed to trust anything now? Claire reached for him, desperate. Daniel, please, I was just trying to fit in with your family, to not see what? I interrupted quietly. Like my daughter? Like the woman who raised you alone? Like the truth itself? The kitchen had become a courtroom indeed. The documents were evidence, the table a bench, the silence a jury. And Claire, for the first time in her life, stood trial before the people she had tried so hard to impress. Daniel backed away from her grasp, his face pale. I don't even know who you are right now. Claire sobbed into her hands, collapsing inward. I gathered the folders one by one, closing them with a finality that echoed. This is the record, I said. Not rumor, not invention. The record of years sacrificed and hidden. Today you all see it, and whether you accept it or not, the truth stands. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I looked at Daniel directly. You deserved honesty. You deserved a foundation of truth. I cannot control what Claire chose to build, but I can refuse to fund deception any longer. The Prescotts exchanged glances, their silence no longer smug, but unsettled. Claire remained crumpled, her tears the only sound, and I stood at the head of the table, not as a burden, not as a shameful secret, but as a woman who had finally laid the evidence bare. The silence stretched in my kitchen until it felt heavier than stone. No one moved. No one spoke. Claire's sobs came in small, sharp gasps, the kind a child makes when they know they have been caught but do not yet understand the sentence. Daniel stood like a statue, staring at the documents, the weight of his fiancée's lies pressing visibly on his shoulders. The Prescotts, usually so polished and in control, shifted uneasily, their faces stripped of their usual superiority. I remained standing at the head of the table, my hands folded gently in front of me. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. When silence can speak, words are unnecessary. Finally, I breathed in, steady and clear, and said the words that ended it all. The wedding is canceled. The house is sold. And I will leave. The declaration was simple, but it rippled through the room with the force of thunder. Claire's head snapped up, streaked with tears. No, she whispered, shaking her head furiously. You can't do that. You can't just walk away. But I already had. Not physically, Not yet, but inside I had stepped across a threshold. The years of sacrifice that had bound me to her demands, the silent debts I carried as though they were vows, all of it dissolved in that moment. "You told me to disappear," I reminded her, my tone even, unshaken. "I'm only doing as you asked." Thematic echo. Her own words turned gently but firmly back to her, like a mirror reflecting a truth too painful to deny. Claire's face twisted as though struck, but I did not flinch. Daniel's voice came next, strained and disbelieving. "Mrs. Ellington, please." "Maybe there's another way." I turned to him, kind but resolute. "Daniel, I respect you. I see the sincerity in you, but this is not my burden to carry anymore. Whatever path you choose with Claire, it will be on foundations you both build, not one stolen from me. My part in this ends here." Victoria pressed her lips together, fury and humiliation battling across her features. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his commanding voice absent for once. Their judgment, the subtle ways they had diminished me for years, no longer mattered. I had nothing left to lose in their eyes, and that was freedom. Claire's chair screeched as she pushed back, standing, trembling. "You're abandoning me," she accused, voice rising. "After everything? After all these years, you're walking away now?" Her words might have pierced me once, but now they fell like pebbles into a river already flowing forward. "I am not abandoning you," I said quietly. "I am releasing you." There's a difference. Abandonment is neglect. Release is a choice, born from love, but also from truth. "You asked me to disappear." I listened. Daniel turned toward her, shock and confusion still plain, but his silence echoed louder than any defense he might have offered. He could no longer protect her illusions, not after what had been revealed. I gathered the folders with deliberate care, sliding each one into a neat stack. My hands did not shake. The act was ceremonial, like closing the final chapter of a book. Then I placed the stack under my arm, smoothed the front of my blouse, and looked around the room one last time. This kitchen had been a courtroom, and like every courtroom, it demanded an ending. The verdict was clear. Without another word, I walked toward the door. My heels made a steady rhythm on the wooden floor, each step a quiet declaration. Behind me, Claire called my name, her voice breaking, but I did not turn back. Daniel's chair scraped against the floor, but he did not follow. Even the Prescotts remained seated, as though rooted by the weight of their own revelations. At the doorway, I paused only long enough to rest my hand against the frame, breathing in the familiar scent of my home, knowing it would not be mine much longer. The house was sold, the wedding was canceled, and I was leaving. Not just the kitchen, not just this confrontation, but the life I had lived in the shadows of sacrifice. Stepping outside, the evening air wrapped around me, cool and still. For the first time in years, I felt tall. Not because I had shouted, not because I had fought, but because I had chosen silence as my shield and truth as my sword. The power had shifted. I was no longer the weak mother begging for a seat at the table. I was the woman who had stood, spoken, and walked away. The door closed behind me, muffling the sound of Claire's sobs. I did not linger. Some stories end not with applause or reconciliation, but with the soft click of a latch and the steady steps of someone who has finally learned the worth of her own dignity. I left in silence, and in that silence, I claimed back my life. I spent the next morning moving through my house like a quiet tide, pulling away pieces of a life that had been anchored here for decades. Each drawer opened to reveal small relics of motherhood. Claire's school report cards, her ballet slippers worn thin at the toes, crayon drawings that once adorned the refrigerator. I touched them, felt the old ache stir, and then folded them into boxes destined for donation. This house had been more than walls. It had been a container for sacrifice. And now, it was time to release it. I kept my movements slow, deliberate. Every item I packed was like a closing sentence. The porcelain dish set I had saved for special occasions went into tissue paper. The photo albums, heavy with moments that were both precious and painful, I left stacked by the door for Claire to collect if she wished. I did not need to carry them anymore. Some memories belong to the past. In the center of the dining table sat the wooden box, small, unadorned, its surface polished smooth by another woman's hands in a coastal workshop. It seemed almost ordinary, but to me it had become an anchor. Inside, I had placed a single photograph. Claire, at 5 years old, perched on my father's lap while he read her a story. Her hair was messy, her smile missing 2 baby teeth, her eyes open wide to the wonder of the tale. It was the last version of her I remembered as pure, untouched by pride or the weight of appearances. Beside the photo lay my note. Every story has origins beyond our control. Every life offers chances to transcend them. Choose wisely. I ran my hand over the lid. This box was not for me. It was for her. A parting gesture, a last gift that carried no demand and no plea, just the truth. As I packed the last of my clothes into a modest suitcase, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My silver-streaked hair fell loose against my shoulders, my eyes lined with years but still steady, still alive. And then the words rose inside me, quiet but undeniable. I was not the worst mother. I was a woman who finally chose the right moment to walk away. It startled me how much peace those words carried. For so long, I had let her judgment define me. Every cruel glance, every dismissal, every moment when she twisted her narrative to erase me, I had swallowed it whole, wondering if she might be right. But the truth stared back at me in that mirror. No woman who works 2 shifts to buy ballet shoes. No mother who mends costumes at midnight or sells pieces of herself to fund law school is the worst mother. What I had been was silent, too silent, until silence became its own prison. Now, silence was my freedom. I would leave without fanfare, without apology. The boxes, stacked neatly in the hallway, told the story of endings. The suitcase by the door told the story of beginnings. I slipped the wooden box into my carry-all bag, the only personal object I would take. Everything else could stay or go, because what mattered now was no longer what I owned, but what I chose. Outside, the sky stretched wide and pale. A bird called from the oak tree in the yard, the same tree that once held Claire's swing. Its branches were bare now, the rope swing long gone, but the memory of her laughter lingered faintly. I let the sound echo in my mind, not with bitterness, but with a kind of farewell. That chapter was over. When the moving truck arrived, the men carried out the furniture with the practiced efficiency of strangers, dismantling someone else's life. I watched them load the heavy dining table, the sofa worn by years of evenings spent alone, the bed where I had once dreamed of reconciliation. Piece by piece, my house emptied, until only the echo of my footsteps remained. I walked through each room one last time. The kitchen where I had measured out patience in cups of tea, the living room where Christmas mornings unfolded with Claire tearing through wrapping paper, the bedroom where grief had curled beside me like a second skin. I touched the walls, whispered thank you, and turned away. At the door, I paused again, suitcase in hand, the wooden box pressed close to my side. I did not feel broken. I did not feel abandoned. I felt lighter. And in that lightness, I understood what my father must have meant when he left me the deed to this house without conditions. It had always been mine, but ownership had never been about signatures. It had been about choice. Today, I was choosing to let go. I stepped outside, locked the door, and slipped the key into an envelope for the new owners. My car was packed, the road waiting. My future was no longer a question mark, but an open page. And as I started the engine, I repeated once more in the quiet, letting the words settle into me like truth, finally spoken aloud. I was not the worst mother. I was a woman who finally chose the right moment to walk away. The drive north stretched for hours, but with each mile, the weight on my chest loosened. Asphalt gave way to winding country roads, then to stretches of pine forest that seemed endless. By the time I reached Maine, the air smelled different, saltier, freer, as though the ocean itself had been waiting for me. I turned onto a gravel path where a small cottage stood on a bluff above the shoreline. Weathered shingles, white trim, a wide wooden porch facing the Atlantic. Modest, unassuming, but alive with a kind of quiet dignity. It was nothing like the Maple Avenue house with its manicured shrubs and polished shutters. This place breathed. This place did not demand approval. I parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my shoes blending with the rush of waves below. The sea air wrapped around me, bracing and cold, filling my lungs with something I had forgotten. Possibility. Carrying my suitcase and the small wooden box, I climbed the steps of the porch. The boards creaked. Not in protest, but in welcome. I stood there for a long time, letting the wind whip strands of silver hair across my face and the horizon stretched wide and merciful, the water restless and alive. For years, I had measured my world in bills, in schedules, in the careful silence of sacrifice. Now the only measure was the tide, rising and falling with no permission asked, no apology given. I unlocked the cottage door with the key the realtor had mailed weeks earlier, back when I only dreamed of escape. Inside, sunlight streamed through sheer curtains, scattering across the pine floors. The room smelled faintly of cedar and salt. There was little furniture, just a worn armchair, a simple table, a narrow bed. But the emptiness felt like freedom, not neglect. I set the wooden box on the windowsill where it caught the afternoon light. Its surface glowed warmly, a reminder of both memory and release. This was my anchor now, not a house full of debts and expectations, but a symbol of choice, of a life I could shape without apology. I carried my suitcase into the bedroom and placed it at the foot of the bed. For the first time in years, unpacking did not feel like an obligation. Each garment folded into the dresser drawers was an affirmation that I had arrived somewhere new. I did not need chandeliers or china sets. I needed this porch, this sea air, this space where silence could mean peace instead of punishment. That evening, I brewed chamomile tea in the small kitchen. The kettle whistled sharply, then softened, and I poured the steaming water over the dried flowers. The fragrance filled the room, the same scent that had carried me through nights of exhaustion and despair. I carried the cup outside and sat on the porch steps, cradling the warmth in my hands. The sun slid low, painting the horizon in streaks of rose and gold. As the waves crashed, steady and eternal, I whispered into the wind, "I am not the worst mother. I am a woman who chose the right moment to walk away." The words did not feel like defense anymore. They felt like praying. I watched a gull soar across the sky, effortless, unburdened. My life until now had been tethered by invisible strings, expectations, obligations, judgments. One by one, I cut them. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but rebirth. When night fell, I lit a single lamp and let its glow spill across the cottage walls. There was no noise of a crowd waiting to humiliate me, no eyes watching for my collapse, just the rhythm of the sea, the pulse of my own heart, and the knowledge that I had reclaimed something sacred, myself. I thought of Helen, my mother, and how she would smile if she saw me here. She had always said, "Steady, Nora. You are steadier than you know." At last I understood. Steadiness was not just endurance. It was the ability to release, to step away, to choose silence as an act of strength. Before bed, I walked once more onto the porch. The stars had appeared, scattered like secrets across the sky. I inhaled deeply, the salt air cold in my lungs, and felt as though the night itself had placed a hand on my shoulder, welcoming me home. This cottage was not grand, but it was mine, a place not of sacrifice, but of renewal, symbolic rebirth. That was what this porch, this wind, this ocean meant. I had left behind the ruins of a canceled wedding, the illusion of a gifted house, the weight of being called the worst mother. Here, with nothing but the sound of waves and the strength of my own breath, I was beginning again. I left the Maple Avenue house without ceremony. The moving men carried out the last of my furniture, and I placed the envelope with the keys on the counter. but before I walked away, I left something small in the living room, set carefully on the windowsill where the light would find it. The wooden box, my last gift. Inside, I placed the photograph of Claire as a child, perched on my father's lap. Her smile was open, toothless, full of trust, the kind of smile only a child can give before the world teaches them to measure affection against status. Beside it, I slipped the note I had written in my own hand. Every story has origins. Every life has choices. Choose wisely. Then I closed the lid and stepped into my new life. It was not long after that Daniel found it. He'd come back to the house searching for Claire, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of the canceled wedding. Instead, he discovered the box. Later, I heard from a neighbor how he stood there for a long time, sunlight catching the wood as though it glowed. He opened it slowly, expecting perhaps receipts, more evidence of lies. Instead, he found the photograph. Claire's small arms wrapped around my father, her head pressed against his chest, her eyes shining with innocence. Daniel turned the photo over and saw the date written in faded ink. Long before he had known her, long before the lies, just a little girl loved and cherished. He held it, his thumb brushing the corner, as though he could feel the weight of the years pressed into that single image. Then he unfolded the note. 3 lines, nothing more. Every story has origins. Every life has choices. Choose wisely. Those words, he later told someone, struck him harder than all the invoices and deeds I had laid on the kitchen table, because they were not accusations, they were not explanations, they were truth distilled, quiet and undeniable. They asked him to reflect not only on Claire's choices, but on his own. He sat down on the empty floor, the wooden box resting on his knees. Around him, the house felt hollow, stripped of the life he thought belonged to them. And in that emptiness, he began to see me differently. Not as the woman Claire had painted, clingy, weak, embarrassing, but as someone who had held a family together until her silence became unbearable. The box worked as I intended. It was not a weapon. It was a mirror. In that mirror, Daniel saw the child Claire once was, the woman I had been, and the truth about what had been squandered. I imagine his parents arriving, their voices sharp, ready to seize control of the story again, but Daniel showed them the note, his voice quiet but firm. She left this. This is who she really is, not what Claire told us. For once, they had no rebuttal. Numbers they could dismiss as cold, deeds they could twist into legal arguments, but this simple gift, was undeniable. It carried the weight of authenticity. I was not there to witness it. I did not need to be. My presence was in the box, in the photo, in the words I chose carefully. Silence had become my language, and this was silence made visible. That night, while waves pounded against the rocks outside my cottage in Maine, I pictured Daniel holding that box. I imagined the flicker of understanding in his eyes, perhaps even respect. He had seen me not through Claire's bitterness, nor through society's dismissal, but through truth itself. It was then I realized why my father left the house in my name without conditions. He trusted me to know when to give, when to hold, and when to let go. This box was not only my last gift to Claire, it was my first gift to myself. The choice to speak without words, the choice to walk away with dignity. And though I knew Claire might toss it aside in anger, Daniel would not. He would remember. He would carry it with him as a reminder of what real love looks like. Not indulgence, not silence that enables, but sacrifice paired with boundaries. Every story has origins. Every life has choices. Choose wisely. I had written it for her, but I understood now that it was also for him, for anyone who needed to see. Even for me. The first evening my mother came to the cottage, the sea was calm. Helen arrived with her cane tapping gently against the porch steps, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a scarf. I helped her settle into the wicker chair, and she looked out at the horizon as though she had been waiting her whole life to see me here. "You did it," she said, her voice both proud and tender. "You finally stepped away." I smiled faintly and carried 2 steaming cups of chamomile tea onto the porch. The fragrance drifted between us, familiar and grounding. I handed her 1 cup, kept the other for myself, and together we sat in silence, listening to the waves crash and retreat. For years, silence had been my prison, a space where I swallowed hurt and deferred to others. But on this porch, with the sea stretching wide, silence became something else. It became a balm, a way of breathing, a way of being. Helen sipped her tea, her sharp eyes catching mine. "Steady, Nora. Always steady. You know, I was afraid you would lose yourself in all that giving. But here you are, you found yourself again." Her words touched something deep in me. I looked at the horizon, where the sky bled pink into blue, and spoke softly. "She told me to disappear. So I did, and in disappearing I found myself." Helen reached over and placed her thin, wrinkled hand on mine. Her grip was gentle, but her presence was steady. "Sometimes," she said, "the only way to be seen is to walk away." We sat for a long while, sipping tea, the waves a steady rhythm beneath our conversation. My chest felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, I was not bracing myself for Claire's disapproval, not calculating how to stretch another paycheck, not waiting for recognition that never came. I was simply here, present, alive, whole. In the fading light, I thought of Claire and Daniel, of the box resting in their hands. I did not know what choices they would make, whether the truth would break them apart or bring them closer. That was their story to write. Mine was already shifting into a different chapter. I had not been the worst mother. I had been a mother who gave too much, too long, without asking for respect in return. And now, I was something else entirely, a woman who understood that walking away is not abandonment, but reclamation. Helen lifted her cup in a small toast. "To begin," she said. I raised mine. "To find ourselves when we thought we were lost." The ocean answered with another crash against the rocks. When the stars appeared, scattered like promises across the night sky, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Peace washed over me, as steady as the tide. Whatever others thought, whether they judged, pitied, or misunderstood, it no longer bound me. My truth was mine. My silence was mine. My future was mine. I turned to Helen and smiled. "It's never too late, is it?" She shook her head with a knowing smile. "No, Nora, it never is." The tea cooled in my hands, but the warmth inside me only deepened. I had not just left a house or a canceled wedding behind. I had stepped out of a story that demanded my disappearance and written a new one where my presence mattered. And now, as the waves rolled and the stars burned above, I ask you, the ones who hear my story, what would you have done if you were me?